I can still feel the blood drying under my nails, crusted from a day that dragged itself through mud and gunpowder. But it's her voice on the other end of the line that pulls me back from the edge. Susan, sweet and steady, like an anchor that doesn't rust. The screen flickers to life with her name before her voice follows, sleepy and soft. David, she says, with that note of concern she can't hide. You sound wrecked. I force out a chuckle, but it comes out like gravel. Long day. Hot. Noisy. The desert sun's unforgiving and the heat's relentless, but it's not the bullets that bother me. It's the waiting. The endless, gnawing waiting for the next bad thing to happen. Tell me about your day, I say, like I'm starved for some kind of ordinary. She talks about grading papers, about the neighbor's dog that somehow got into her garden again, about her sister's new boyfriend who everyone else likes but she swears has shifty eyes. It's trivial stuff, but that's the whole point. It reminds me that somewhere there's a life waiting for me that's not sand and smoke. That's not fighting a war half the world away. And then, just when I'm beginning to feel some warmth seep back into my bones, she hits me with the thing that changes everything. I'm thinking of getting a dog, she says, like it's no big deal. I choke out a laugh. A dog? Since when do you like dogs? Since now, I guess, she says, her voice light. I was thinking something small, something that won't tear up the furniture. I imagine her with a dog, something with floppy ears that would follow her everywhere. The thought settles something inside me, something that's been rattling loose for too long. You know, we could get one when I'm back, I say, trying to sound casual. We. She repeats, like she's testing the word for its weight. Yeah. We. I want that. More than anything. Maybe I'm a fool for planning a future when my own feels about as stable as a sandcastle at high tide. But I need something to cling to. Something to keep me sane. We talk about it for the next few nights, sketching out this dream like it's already real. A little house, her work, my discharge papers framed on a wall. The dog she decides should be called Rusty, even though she hasn't picked a breed. It sounds good. It sounds real. But even as we're making these plans, there's something in her voice. A hesitation. A sliver of something that doesn't belong. Maybe it's nothing. Or maybe it's the first hint of everything that's about to go wrong. I should press her about it, but I'm too damn tired and the thought of hearing something I don't want to hear scares me more than enemy fire. So I let it slide. I tell myself she's just tired. Just distracted. She's still Susan. Still waiting for me. Isn't she? The blast came like the world collapsing in on itself, a roar that punched through my body before I even felt the pain. One moment I was shouting commands, the next I was staring up at a sky too bright, too blue for what had just happened. Pain blurred the edges of everything. Voices around me rose and fell like waves, someone pressing down hard on what I couldn't see but felt burning and wrong. I tried to push up on my elbows, but my arms trembled and gave out like straw under a boot. It wasn't until I woke up days later that I understood the truth. They say losing a limb feels like a trick your mind plays on itself. Phantom pain, they call it. As if the leg that was no longer there could still throb and ache and cramp. They weren't wrong. I'd wake up clawing at sheets soaked in sweat, convinced I could still feel the curve of my toes, the stiffness in my knee. But it was gone. Nothing left but a stump wrapped tight in bandages and pitying glances from nurses who couldn't meet my eyes. I learned to smile when they asked how I was holding up. I lied like it was another part of my training. But the truth was, I had one thought hammering away in my head every waking hour. I needed to talk to Susan. Needed to hear her voice, to make sure she was still real and waiting for me. When they finally let me have my phone, my fingers shook as I dialed her number. I could barely get the words out before she was crying and saying how relieved she was, how terrified she'd been when she heard about the attack. It took everything I had not to break down right there. I told her I was okay, that it wasn't as bad as they made it sound, that I'd be back as soon as I could. But I couldn't bring myself to tell her the whole truth. Not then. Not when her voice was the only thing holding me together. As the weeks dragged on, I replayed our conversations over and over, like a loop I couldn't escape. She kept talking about the future, about our plans and the dog and how she couldn't wait for me to come home. And I kept nodding along, pretending I could still picture all those things without this shadow creeping over everything. They moved me to a rehabilitation center where the days stretched out like years. Physical therapy was brutal, my body straining against itself, fighting for some sense of normalcy. I hated the mirrors, hated the way the other guys looked at me, their own injuries like badges of shame they were too proud to admit. But the worst part was the waiting. Waiting for Susan to visit. Waiting to hear her say everything was still okay. That we were still okay. She promised she'd come as soon as she could, that she just needed to work out a few things with her job. I believed her. I clung to that belief like it was the last piece of me still intact. I spent my nights staring at my phone, willing it to ring, praying for her name to flash across the screen. When she finally called, her voice was strained, like she was trying too hard to sound cheerful. I asked when she'd be coming, and she hesitated just long enough for my chest to tighten. Soon, she said, just give me a little more time. I told her I'd wait as long as it took. What I didn't say was how much it hurt, that creeping suspicion twisting itself into knots inside me. But I pushed it down, swallowed it whole, because the idea of her not being there was worse than anything else. I needed her to be the same. To want me the same way she had before. To love me despite what I'd become. Maybe I should have known better. Maybe I should have seen the signs. But I was too focused on what I needed to keep myself from falling apart. Susan showed up 2 days later, her hair tangled from the wind and her eyes rimmed red like she hadn't slept the whole way there. She threw her arms around me before I could say a word, her face pressed against my shoulder as she whispered how sorry she was, how guilty she felt for not being there sooner. I held her as tight as I could, ignoring the awkwardness of the wheelchair, the way the metal frame seemed to mock everything that had been taken from me. She pulled back just enough to study me, her fingers brushing over my face like she was making sure I was really there. I kept telling her I was fine, that I was just glad she'd made it, that I didn't care about anything else as long as she was here now. But her guilt clung to her like a fog she couldn't shake off. She kept apologizing, kept insisting she would have come sooner if it hadn't been for work, for her boss throwing extra shifts at her right when she needed to leave. I believed her. I needed to believe her. It was easier than thinking she had hesitated, that maybe she hadn't wanted to face what was left of me. I tried to push those thoughts down, to drown them out with the relief of finally having her beside me. And for a while, it worked. Susan moved into the room the hospital arranged for family visitors, close enough that she could be there whenever I needed her. She'd bring me breakfast in the mornings, her hands always shaking just a little when she handed me the tray. She'd sit with me during therapy, her encouragement forcing me through the pain, her smile bright enough to make me forget everything else. At night, she'd tell me about her day, about the garden she'd planted that was already being torn apart by the neighbor's dog. I'd laugh and tell her we'd build a better fence when I got back, that Rusty would keep the pests away. But even in those moments, something felt off. She was there, but she wasn't. Her eyes would drift to her phone more often than I could count, her fingers twitching whenever it buzzed. At first, I brushed it off. She had work, after all. A life that didn't stop just because mine had been turned inside out. I kept telling myself it was nothing, that I was being paranoid, that the war had messed with my head more than I wanted to admit. But the calls kept coming, the texts lighting up her screen like fireflies in the dark. Sometimes she'd answer right there in front of me, her voice clipped and businesslike, her eyes flicking toward me as if to make sure I wasn't listening too closely. Other times she'd excuse herself, stepping out into the hallway with her phone clutched tight in her hand. She'd come back smiling, but it always looked forced, like she was wearing it more than feeling it. I tried not to let it bother me, tried to tell myself she was just handling whatever mess her boss had dumped on her. But doubt is a parasite that feeds on silence, and I'd spent too many nights alone with nothing but my own thoughts gnawing away at me. I asked her once who kept calling so much, my voice casual enough that it sounded like I was just making conversation. She laughed it off, said it was work, that her new supervisor was too incompetent to handle anything without her. I laughed along with her, but her answer twisted something inside me. Because I knew Susan. I knew her tells, the way she'd avoid eye contact when she was hiding something, the way her hands would fidget like they were guilty of something her words wouldn't confess. And I saw all of that now, clear as day. But I kept my mouth shut, afraid of what might spill out if I pushed her too hard. I told myself I was just being insecure, that losing my leg had left me grasping for things to be angry about. I told myself she loved me, that she was here, and that was all that mattered. But doubt doesn't care about logic. It doesn't care about good intentions or second chances. It just sinks in, roots deep, and waits for the moment you can't pretend anymore. And I could feel that moment creeping closer, like a shadow that stretched itself over everything we tried to build. Getting discharged was supposed to feel like freedom, but instead it felt like getting thrown into a world I no longer recognized. They'd told me I was ready to go home, that I'd made progress most men could only dream of. But what they couldn't fix was the part of me that still woke up in a cold sweat, reaching for a leg that wasn't there. Susan was there to help me pack up my things, her smile strained but determined. I tried to match her enthusiasm, tried to act like going home was the answer to everything. We made the drive back to our old apartment in silence, her fingers drumming against the steering wheel while I stared out the window and tried to remember what normal was supposed to feel like. The first few days were rougher than I'd expected. The space I'd once called home felt smaller, like the walls were inching closer every time I looked away. Susan hovered over me, her concern bleeding through her every word, her every action. She tried to keep me comfortable, tried to keep me entertained, but it always felt like she was tiptoeing around something she couldn't say. We had our good moments. We'd watch movies like we used to, her head resting on my shoulder, her laughter soft and sweet when I made some dumb joke just to hear it. But those moments were getting harder to come by, like they were slowly being chipped away by something neither of us wanted to acknowledge. I focused on my recovery, throwing myself into the exercises the therapists drilled into my head. I refused to let myself be helpless, refused to let my new reality beat me down. The prosthetic leg they fitted me with was clunky, uncomfortable, but I was determined to master it. I spent hours practicing, pushing through the pain until exhaustion dragged me under. Susan tried to be supportive, but her patience seemed thinner than it once was. She'd praise my progress, but her eyes always looked distant, her smile never quite reaching where it used to. And then there was the phone, still buzzing at all hours, her excuses wearing thinner each time I asked. It became easier not to ask at all. The day the money came through was one of those strange, disorienting days that leaves you questioning whether you've woken up in the right world. I'd been expecting something, sure. They told me compensation would be arranged, that the loss of my leg was considered a sacrifice deserving of more than just a pat on the back and a salute. But when the letter arrived and I saw the numbers printed there, it didn't seem real. It was a fortune. More than I'd ever dreamed of having, more than my parents had made in a lifetime of scraping by. I showed Susan the check, her eyes widening as she stared at it like she'd never seen paper before. She laughed, a bright, genuine laugh that echoed through the room like sunlight cracking through a storm. For the first time in months, I felt like maybe things were going to be okay. We started making plans, real plans, not just the hazy daydreams we used to toss around. I talked about buying a house, something with enough space for the dog she still hadn't decided on. I talked about finding a new job, something I could actually do despite everything I'd lost. She nodded along, her smile unwavering, but there was a sharpness in her eyes that kept me from relaxing. She started making suggestions, talking about investments, about ways to grow the money instead of just spending it. It made sense, sure, but her eagerness felt off somehow. Like she was more excited about the money than the fact that I'd survived long enough to receive it. I tried not to read too much into it. Tried to convince myself that I was just being paranoid, that I was letting my own insecurities cloud my judgment. But those thoughts were getting harder to shake. And as the days dragged on, I found myself clinging to that check like it was the last piece of solid ground I had left. Because if I was wrong about Susan, if I was wrong about everything we planned, then all I had left was a pile of money that couldn't even buy back the life I used to have. I tried to ignore the way her phone never seemed to stop buzzing, the way her smile always looked a little too forced, the way she seemed to relax only when I was talking about finances instead of feelings. But it was there, festering beneath the surface, a wound that wouldn't heal no matter how hard I tried to pretend everything was fine. Maybe I was just imagining things. Maybe the accident had left me with more scars than I could see. But deep down, I knew something was wrong. And no amount of money was going to fix it. The night it all fell apart started like any other, the kind of quiet you don't appreciate until you realize how fragile it really is. I'd gone to bed early, exhaustion pressing down on me like a weight I couldn't shake. Susan had stayed up late again, something about catching up on emails, her voice distant when I'd asked her to come to bed. I drifted off to sleep eventually, the kind of restless sleep where every creak of the house feels like an intruder sneaking through your dreams. It was the crash that woke me, the sharp splintering of wood and the heavy thud of footsteps echoing down the hall. I jolted awake, my body tensing instinctively even though I knew I wasn't the man I used to be. Panic flared hot in my chest, my hands fumbling for the crutch I kept propped against the bed. Susan was already awake, her eyes wide and terrified as she looked toward the bedroom door. Before either of us could move, he was there. A man standing in the doorway, tall and broad-shouldered, his face hidden behind a cheap hockey mask that looked like something plucked from a Halloween store. He held a gun in one hand, the barrel gleaming under the weak glow of the bedside lamp. His voice was rough, jagged around the edges like broken glass, shouting words I couldn't fully process at first. It was only when he stormed into the room, waving the gun like a conductor's baton, that I caught the words spilling from his mouth. The check. He wanted the check. The one I'd spent days trying to figure out how to use, how to invest, how to build a future from the ashes of everything that had been taken from me. My heart slammed against my ribs, a frantic drumbeat that drowned out rational thought. Susan was crying, her hands clutched against her chest like she was trying to hold herself together. I tried to speak, to reason with the man, but he cut me off, his voice rising to a frantic pitch as he screamed for the money. I told him where it was, my words tumbling out in a rush as I pointed toward the drawer where I'd stashed the check. The man tore through the room like a wild animal, yanking the drawer open and snatching the paper from inside. His breathing was harsh, rattling through the mask like a monster dragging itself from some dark place. I thought that would be the end of it. I thought he'd take the money and leave, vanish into the night like a nightmare that couldn't hurt us once we were awake. But then he grabbed Susan. It happened so fast I barely registered it, his arm lashing out and seizing her by the wrist, dragging her toward the door with a strength that seemed unnatural. She screamed, her voice shredding through the air like something alive and desperate. I tried to move, tried to push myself off the bed, but my leg betrayed me, the prosthetic useless in the chaos of the moment. The man kept yelling, saying he needed insurance, saying he couldn't leave without something to make sure we wouldn't call the police. His words tumbled over each other, frantic and half-mad, like he was trying to convince himself as much as us. Susan's eyes met mine, wide and terrified, her lips forming words I couldn't understand over the pounding in my ears. I shouted for him to stop, begged him to leave her alone, but my voice sounded small and broken, swallowed by the panic clawing at my throat. He dragged her out of the room, her scream cutting off like a severed wire as the door slammed behind them. I tried to follow, tried to force myself to my feet, but the pain shot through me like fire, my muscles trembling under the weight of my own uselessness. By the time I made it to the door, they were gone. The house felt empty, the air thick with the aftermath of violence and desperation. I collapsed against the wall, my breath coming in ragged gasps as I tried to make sense of what had just happened. The check was gone. But worse than that, Susan was gone. Taken by a man who'd stormed into our lives and ripped everything apart in a matter of minutes. I should have been able to stop him. I should have been able to protect her. But all I could do was lie there, helpless and broken, while the world crumbled around me. And somewhere deep inside, I felt something snap, something that had been holding me together with nothing but sheer stubbornness and denial. Because now it wasn't just about surviving. Now it was about getting her back. No matter what it took. The days that followed felt like drowning. Every minute stretched out like a wound that refused to close. I tried calling Susan's phone 100 times, my fingers trembling so bad I could barely dial. Every call went straight to voicemail, the same automated voice droning on like a funeral hymn. I reported the break-in to the police, told them everything I could remember about the man in the hockey mask. They took my statement with the kind of detached professionalism that makes you feel like just another file gathering dust in some drawer. Days turned to weeks, and still nothing. No word from Susan, no updates from the police beyond the occasional shrug and hollow reassurance that they were doing all they could. I spent hours staring at the ceiling, my thoughts chasing themselves in circles until they twisted into knots of guilt and anger and desperation. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw her being dragged out of the room, her scream echoing in my head like a broken record. The money was gone. All that compensation they'd handed me like it was supposed to make everything better, wiped out in a single night by a man whose face I'd never even seen. I spent what little I had left trying to piece my life back together, but everything felt wrong. Like I was trying to build something out of broken glass and wishing it would hold. It was out of sheer desperation that I hired the detective. I had nothing left to lose, nothing left to hope for except the faint, stubborn belief that Susan was still out there waiting to be saved. The detective's name was Brooks, a man who looked like he'd seen too much of the world and didn't care for most of it. He listened to my story without interrupting, his eyes sharp and calculating as he scribbled notes in a battered notebook. I didn't trust him, but I didn't trust anyone anymore. Still, he was all I had. Weeks passed with nothing but occasional calls from Brooks asking for details I barely remembered. Every time the phone rang, my heart would leap, only to crash back down when I realized it was just more questions and no answers. And then, finally, Brooks called me into his office. I could hear something in his voice that hadn't been there before, something sharp and cold and final. I dragged myself downtown, the cab ride a blur of noise and movement that felt too real and too distant all at once. Brooks wasted no time when I sat down, his expression grim as he pushed a stack of papers across the desk. Photos, phone records, documents I couldn't make sense of until he started talking. It was all planned. Every word felt like a stone sinking into my gut. Susan hadn't been taken. She hadn't been some helpless victim caught in the crossfire of a desperate man's greed. She'd been the architect of the whole thing. The man in the hockey mask wasn't a stranger. He was her new boyfriend, someone she'd met months ago and started planning this whole charade with. They'd needed a way to get their hands on the money without risking a messy divorce, so they'd cooked up the robbery like it was some kind of sick joke. She'd stayed by my side during rehab, pretended to care, all while setting me up for the biggest betrayal of my life. Brooks laid it all out, his words cutting like knives as he walked me through their plan. The fake robbery, the frantic calls to her so-called boss that were really just her plotting the next step, the way she pretended to be terrified while slipping messages to her boyfriend when I wasn't looking. They'd waited until I had the check in my hands, then staged the whole thing to make it look like a break-in gone wrong. And I'd played right into their hands. I felt sick, my hands shaking as I stared at the evidence Brooks had gathered. Phone records showing calls between Susan and her boyfriend, text messages spelling out their plans in a language so casual it made my skin crawl. Photos of them together, laughing and wrapped around each other like they were the only people in the world. I wanted to tear the pages to shreds, to pretend none of it was real. But the truth sat there, cold and heavy and undeniable. Brooks asked me what I wanted to do, his voice flat like he'd already guessed the answer. I told him to go to the police. To hand over everything he'd found and make sure they paid for what they'd done. The authorities took the evidence and ran with it, their interest suddenly renewed once they realized this wasn't just some random home invasion. They arrested Susan and her boyfriend a few days later, their faces splashed across the news like something out of a bad crime show. I watched the footage with a numbness that felt like it belonged to someone else. Susan's eyes were wide and frightened as they led her away in handcuffs, her boyfriend sneering at the cameras like he thought he was some kind of mastermind instead of a coward hiding behind a mask. The trial was quick, the evidence too overwhelming to drag things out. They were both sentenced to prison, their sentences long enough that I'd be a different man by the time they ever saw daylight again. Everyone kept telling me I'd done the right thing, that I'd found justice, that I could finally move on. But all I felt was empty. I spent so long trying to find her, trying to believe she was worth saving, only to find out she'd never been the woman I thought she was. The money didn't matter. None of it mattered. All I had left was a broken body and a heart that didn't seem to beat the same way it used to. But even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I needed something more. Something that would make everything that had happened feel like more than just another scar. I didn't know what that was yet. But I knew I wasn't done searching.